gentlemen, and thank you for joining me for your top human rights organization review. I am your host, Bryce Dolan. Now today on the show, we're going to look at 5 different top human rights organizations, and we'll look at the top stories from each one of their websites. Today on the show, we actually have several stories that are updates from earlier segments earlier on this year. Now first we'll begin the show with Amnesty International, as they say 2 Ukrainian men were jailed in Russia after being tortured into confessing to a series of murders, and that they are the victims of a travesty of justice. Now Stanislav Klik and Mikhail Karpiuk were convicted of killing Russian soldiers in Chechnya in the 1990s, despite both providing credible evidence that they were not in the unstable region at the time. Moscow's Supreme Court upheld sentences of 22 years in jail for Karpiuk and 20 for Klik. Russia's case against these men defies reason. The numerous fair trial violations and the unconvincing prosecution evidence all point to a fabricated case. They were denied access to their lawyers of choice and alleged that their confessions were forced from them as a result of torture, said John Dalhousen, Amnesty International's Europe and Central Asia Regional Office Director. Rather than taking the opportunity to correct this blatant travesty of justice, Moscow's Supreme Court has again overlooked the evidence and upheld the prosecution case in this propaganda-driven show trial. Now, Klik and Karpiuk, who belong to a Ukrainian right-wing nationalist group, were unable to use their chosen lawyers for several months after their arrest in 2014, during which time they alleged they were tortured into confessing. Now, Stanislav Klik said he was forced to drink vodka until he lost consciousness, given mind-altering psychotropic drugs, hung from his bars in his cell, subjected to electric shocks, and kept in solitary confinement for more than a year. None of these torture allegations have been investigated. The Russian authorities must investigate the serious allegations of torture at the hands of its law enforcement personnel, as well as the denial of access to a lawyer, said John Dalhousen, after Amnesty International attended the appeal hearing in Moscow. Now, the torture has affected the mental health of Stanislav Klik. He appeared severely disturbed throughout the trial, which began in October 2015. Now, to give you an idea of how disturbed he seemed during the trial, he undressed himself first in the courtroom, shouted abuse, and hung himself upside down inside the defendant's cage. In November 2015, he cut himself with a blade to protest against the authorities' refusal to carry out a medical examination. And then this year in October, he claimed not to remember his date of birth during a court hearing and asked to be defended by Stanislav Mikhailov, a Russian pop star. Now, all requests for Stanislav Klik to be offered an independent psychiatric examination have been refused, and he has instead been declared fit to stand trial. Now, let's get this straight, ladies and gentlemen. He claimed that they made him drink vodka until he lost consciousness. He claimed that they gave him psychotropic drugs, hung him from his bars. Well, this guy's apparently crazy. But here's the thing. Before he was arrested, he wasn't like this. He had no mental disabilities, he had no mental disorders, nothing was wrong with him in that sense. And after over a year of being in jail, being in solitary confinement, going through all this torture, of course it has driven him mad, and I have no doubt that he is telling the truth of everything that they have done to him. So hopefully justice can help these 2 get free soon. Now, Human Rights Watch says government officials and other authorities in Nigeria have raped and sexually exploited women and girls displaced by the conflict with Boko Haram. Now, the government is not doing enough to protect displaced women and girls and ensure that they have access to basic rights and services, or to sanction the abusers, who include camp leaders, vigilante groups, policemen, and soldiers. Now, in late July 2016, Human Rights Watch documented sexual abuse, including rape and exploitation of 43 women and girls living in 7 internally displaced persons camps, or IDP camps, in the Borno state capital. Now, the victims had been displaced from several Borno towns and villages. In some cases, the victims had arrived in the underserved camps, where their movement is severely restricted after spending months in military screening camps. Is it bad enough that these women and girls are not getting much needed support for the horrific trauma they suffered at the hands of Boko Haram? Said Masi Segun, senior Nigeria researcher at Human Rights Watch. It is disgraceful and outrageous that people who should protect these women and girls are attacking and abusing them. 4 of the victims told Human Rights Watch that they were drugged and raped, while 37 were coerced into sex through false marriage promises and material and financial assistance. Many of those coerced into sex said they were abandoned if they became pregnant. They and their children have suffered discrimination, abuse, and stigmatization from other camp residents. Now, 8 of the victims said they were previously abducted by Boko Haram and forced into marriage before they escaped to the IDP camp. Now, the Boko Haram conflict has led to more than 10,000 civilian deaths since 2009. The abductions of at least 2,000 people, mostly women and children, and large groups of students, including from Chibok and Damasak. The forced recruitment of hundreds of men, and the displacement of about 2.5 million people in northeast Nigeria. So not only are these women and girls suffering exploitation and sexual abuse from Boko Haram soldiers and followers, they're suffering at the hands of refugee camp and IDP camp authorities and officials. In particular, one story in this article you can find on the website, one of the girls tells her story of how a police officer approached her in one of these IDP camps to befriend her, or so she thought, and they ended up having sexual relations. She got pregnant. She goes up to tell him, like, hey, I got pregnant. He pulls out a gun and says, if you tell anybody, I will kill you. She was too scared to tell anybody else, and now she's by herself trying to protect and raise her kids. So that's just one story out of countless cases that have happened in Nigeria. Now, we covered in an earlier segment that Human Rights Foundation was calling on the UN Human Rights Council to not elect dictatorships and human rights violators on the Human Rights Council. Well, on October 28th, the United Nations General Assembly rejected the Russian government from the 14 members it elected to the UN Human Rights Council. The members newly elected to the council are Croatia, Hungary, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Tunisia, China, Japan, South Africa, Rwanda, Brazil, Cuba, the US, and the UK. Although numerous authoritarian regimes were elected, including the brutal dictatorships of China, Cuba, Egypt, Rwanda, and Saudi Arabia, the fact that the government of Croatia was chosen over Putin's regime brings immeasurable hope for the Council's future, said Thor Halvorsen, president of the Human Rights Foundation. It appears the world is communicating that a regime that invades neighbors like Ukraine and Georgia, rules other like Chechnya by proxy, and bombs hospitals in Syria perhaps isn't suited to the world's top human rights body. This is a significant and monumental surprise, Halvorsen added. Now, Russia received 112 votes to be on the UN Human Rights Council. They lost its regional seat to Croatia by 114 votes. They didn't lose by 114 votes, but that's how many votes Croatia received. So technically, Russia only lost its seat by 2 votes. So although it was a great success that Russia did not get elected to this Human Rights Council, it only didn't get elected by 2 votes. 2. So I don't know how much of a win you can count this for the UN Human Rights Council, especially because they elected Saudi Arabia, China, Cuba, other authoritarian regimes. But the main one, the big bad boy, Russia, Putin, at least he is out of there. Now, our last 2 stories call out 2 different governments on their inaction. First, the International Federation for Human Rights, the FIDH, said that more than 6 months after taking power, Burma's new government, led by Aung San Suu Kyi's National League for Democracy, or the NLD party, has failed to adequately address the long-standing discriminatory and abusive practices against Rohingya in the Rakhine State. So again, we've touched on this a number of times, and we are going to touch on it again. Now, the NLD has made no attempt to remove the legal obstacles that seriously restrict the fundamental rights of the Rohingya. This includes the failure to officially repeal orders from local authorities, decreed under previous military governments between 1993 and 2009, which imposed restrictions on freedom of movement, marriage, childbirth, access to basic services, and livelihood opportunities for Rohingya. Parliament, dominated by NLD lawmakers and the executive branch, headed by President Tin Kyaw and State Councilor Aung San Suu Kyi, have also failed to take any action towards the review and amendment of the 1982 citizenship law. The law is not in line with international standards and restricts access to citizenship for Rohingya. Now, instead of encouraging a parliamentary review of the 1982 citizenship law, the government has pursued the previous administration's flawed approach to the issue of Rohingya citizenship and resurrected a pilot citizenship verification process for stateless Muslims, including Rohingya. Regrettably, the government has also decided to follow the previous administration's official policy of avoiding the use of the term Rohingya. Now, since the new government took office, reports of human rights violations committed by security forces against Rohingya in Rakhine State have continued to surface. A fresh outbreak of violence in northern Rakhine State in this October underscored the decades-old pattern of persecution against Rohingya and impunity of those responsible. In addition, the situation in IDP camps in Rakhine State remains dire. About 120,000 internally displaced persons, the vast majority of whom are Rohingya, remain in IDP camps across Rakhine State. So again, as Aung San Suu Kyi and her NLD party are leading this country, the Rakhine State and the Rohingya are still suffering scores and scores of human rights violations, and it doesn't look like there's anything that's going to be done to help it. Now, to end the show, Protection International calls on the Indonesian government to protect human rights defenders. According to researches carried out by the Center for Applied Human Rights at the UK-based University of York, activists are victims of various types of abuse, most commonly threats through phone calls and text messages. Furthermore, they experience assault, become the subject of criminal charges and investigations, and often face defamation by the media. Now, activists are always abused because they're at the forefront of human rights conflicts, so the opposing side always wants to shut them down, said Protection International activist Kahidi as he told the Jakarta Post, adding that the government should protect activists. Now, this article, this particular story, came from the Jakarta Post and was shared by Protection International. However, according to a survey from the Center for Applied Human Rights at the UK-based University of York, the government is the most common violator against human rights activists. The survey stated that the government included the police, the military, and regional government officers. Companies, particularly those related to environment and labor rights issues, come second, while fundamental religious organizations rank third, according to the survey. Now, the survey was conducted earlier this year on 87 human rights activists of various issues like the environment, LGBT and women's rights, and religious freedom. As many as 90% of the respondents said they were worried about their safety. Many expected President Joko Widodo, or President Jokowi, to suppress violence in his 2 years of rule, but activists recently said he had failed to do so, highlighting the growing violence that the president had been unable to manage. Now, Contras coordinator Haris Azhar said human rights could not be enforced in Indonesia if Jokowi still gave strategic positions to people who had been involved in human rights violations. The violations against human rights increased in Jokowi's era, he said earlier this year. Now, Haris said that Contras recorded at least 300 human rights violations in 2015, higher than the previous year, or when the former president is in office. So again, we see a new leader come into a government that has a history of human rights violations, of human rights activist oppression, and we see new leadership come in, and the cases of these violations rise instead of decrease or essentially disappear. Unfortunately, the number of it has been growing. So ladies and gentlemen, if you want to look into any of these articles any further, you can find the links directly to these articles and their websites below in the description. While you're looking at those, I encourage you to subscribe to our YouTube channel, give us a like on Facebook, or follow us on Twitter. But thank you for watching, ladies and gentlemen. This was your top human rights organization review, and I was your host, Bryce Dolan.